Mark, thank you for joining me virtually today. I know you've actually been to Jagga Jagga recently, so you've actually seen in person how passionate people here are about climate change and how much they want action. Obviously, there's so much going on at the moment, and I thought it would be really good to be able to talk to you about that and about what you think might come next. So thanks for taking the time to do this today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
The first thing I thought I might ask you about is what is happening at the moment. We've all started leading quite different lives. Industries shut down, transport shut down, people aren't flying. Is there a difference that's making to global emissions? And is that something that we might see a difference going forward from?
Well, there was actually a paper published over the last couple of days in the Nature magazine, which is one of the most important scientific journals internationally, which thinks that or suggests that carbon emissions this year for 2020 will probably be down somewhere between 4 and 7% compared to last year, because, as you say, there's been such a lockdown, particularly in transport. And aviation emissions are effectively gone. There's a lot of land transport emissions, particularly car emissions, that are down. And although it hasn't happened here in Australia, a number of other countries have shut down big parts of their manufacturing, which has also led to a reduction in emissions. So you will see the data come off here to a degree, but in other countries to a greater degree for 2020. But there's no suggestion that that's other than a blip. It still doesn't remove the need for the focused work on decarbonising the global economy and harnessing the enormous benefits of a transformation to clean energy.
Do you think there's room, now that we have gone through this big change, to make change to climate? In Australia, it feels like we have been stuck in a pattern for so long, and I watched the recent Four Corners on really a decade of not being able to get any significant action on climate change. Can this be our moment to change some of that?
It can be, and I hope it will be. It's not obviously entirely within our remit. We need the government to shift. But I think the really notable thing here in Australia and across the world is the chorus of voices: banks, investors, big regulators, the central banks of the world. There was a very big study released recently by Oxford University that included a survey of 200 central bank governors, a whole range of other finance ministries. They're all saying that the economic recovery plan out of COVID-19 must dovetail with the need to deal with climate change. It needs to be a clean energy focused recovery plan. And here in Australia over the last week, you've seen a coalition of the 4 big banks, the big insurers, the big super funds, big asset managers. So all of the big investors, all of the money in Australia, saying we can't use the recovery plan to invest in old stuff, like stuff that will be stranded in a transition to clean energy. It's got to be a big investment in clean energy. And we know for Australia, because we have such vast resources of clean energy, if you read Ross Garnaut's work on superpower, if you read the Grattan Institute's recent work on the steel industry, we have enormous opportunities to get investment here in Australia, to get jobs here in Australia. So this should be a good thing coming out of an awful pandemic.
And do you think people are open to hearing about that? Again, thinking about this from a Labor perspective, I know that one of the things we've talked about is that it's difficult to talk people through a big change and to talk about what a future might look like when you can't quite see it. Do you think having had this big experience and big disruption means that there's more room for that conversation here?
Well, Kate, yourself, that people are still very focused on the pandemic. Perhaps the focus has moved a little bit away from the day-to-day fears of the health impacts, because Australia has done so well at getting those under some level of control, but they're very focused on the day-to-day economic impacts. But I'm noticing, and I'm sure you are, that people are starting to think about, well, what next? What has this crisis shown us about Australia? I mean, these sorts of crises really strip a nation bare. It really strips back everything so that you can see what works well. what really stood us in good stead through this crisis, like our public health system, which is really probably the best in the world. But what didn't serve us well, what let people down? And I think, insecurity of employment, having 1 in 3 workers without access to leave entitlements is an obvious example of that. But I think also, talking in my community, I imagine this is the same in yours, Kate, that people also really notice the degree to which we've run down our manufacturing capability here in Australia over the last few decades in particular, to the point where it's lower than it's ever been since World War II. And so I think they want to see an investment in Australian capability, in Australian jobs. And that will only happen if you get energy policy right and climate policy right. So, when I talk to people in my community, they are thinking about these things. They're thinking about the sorts of jobs that we can start building, maybe not for tomorrow, but for the next number of years. So we're not placed in this position again when the next crisis hits.
So what's the challenge then in making that happen? And I want to ask a question about what the government's doing at the moment. We're 2 Labor MPs chatting to each other, so there's not quite a way I can ask that without it being a bit of a free kick. But tell us what's happening with the government, what are we seeing from their end, what's the policy development they're doing?
Well, a couple of things. Most recently, you've seen over the last couple of days 2 big reports released by the government. A report by Grant King, who used to run Origin Energy for many years, former president of the Business Council, into their climate change policy. And probably the big takeout from that is a focus on carbon capture and storage. So that sort of focus, I think, is a big signal about where the government's going. A big focus on gas, which you've seen from the COVID Recovery Commission, which is a commission made up of a number of people with a very significant background in the gas industry. So perhaps unsurprisingly, they're making a lot of recommendations about more gas. So I think that's something that we need to come to grips with as a Labor Party, but as a community as well. And then most recently, this morning, we've seen the release of a technology roadmap on energy by the government. Now, roadmap's all well and good as far as it goes, but you don't have to spend too much time searching Google to find report after report after report to tell you what's happening in energy technology. And they all say the same thing, and that is the future of electricity lies in renewable energy. Renewable energy, solar and wind, firmed up with batteries and with pumped hydro and things like that, that is the cheapest and the cleanest way to renew our electricity system in Australia, which is getting very old and increasingly unreliable. But in addition to that sort of stuff, the government's roadmap has another focus on nuclear energy, very expensive, really a fantasy to think that you're going to get that in Australia anytime soon. If you did, it would be vastly expensive electricity. And some other things like a bit more focus on gas as well. But having a roadmap's one thing. What you need is an investment framework that gives investors the confidence to start building the electricity infrastructure we need. I mean, the Reserve Bank has told us that last year, renewable energy investment collapsed by more than 50% because of the lack of an energy policy from Canberra. There's lots of money ready to go, lots of businesses ready to invest. But when the government doesn't have an energy policy they can rely upon and securely plan their investment, they're simply not going to commit the dollars. And we're seeing that already. The other problem with the government's position is they continue not to commit to a net zero emissions position by 2050. Every state government's done it, Liberal and Labor alike. Every business group has done it. We've been advised by the Australian Academy of Science and the CSIRO that we must get to net zero emissions by 2050 if we're going to deal with the worst impacts of climate change. But this government simply can't bring itself to do it. And I think, your community will see, as mine does, I'm sure, the double standards in a government that spent the last couple of months, quite rightly, following the advice of our medical scientists, including a very substantial lockdown on our economy, while at the same time continuing to reject the advice of our climate scientists, the Academy, the CSIRO, who say that we must be at net zero emissions by 2050. And indeed, the CSIRO says if we do that, wages will be higher, economic growth will be higher. So resolving these double standards, this conflict within the government when it comes to climate change, is absolutely essential to getting us back on the right pathway.
Yeah, that point around the science is certainly one I've been thinking about, that, yeah, we saw the potential there, that governments can listen to the science and that people appreciate it when they do, and respond to clear messages that are based on expert advice. So it would be wonderful if the government could take that out. But from a Labor perspective, what do we do about it? How are we going to keep the pressure on and try and get a better outcome here?
Well, we've got to keep the pressure on for good policy. We've got to make the argument for good policy. As you mentioned, the Four Corners report, it's been a hard road over the last 10 years, but this is, this is a central Labor value, dealing with climate change. It's an essential Labor value. It's the right economic thing to do. It's the right environmental thing to do. And it's, I think, one of our deepest responsibilities that we have as a country, certainly as a political representative, to our children and our children's children. Make sure that the society and the environment we hand down to them is as good as it possibly can be. So we've just got to continue making the argument, as hard as it can sometimes be, given some of the positions taken by particularly media interests and others in the parliament. Make the argument for good policy. And that argument is best made when it's guided by the scientific and the economic advice. And that's what we've always tried to do, and that's what we'll do over coming months.
Mark, thank you. I think it is going to be a challenging couple of months. So I look forward to seeing you in Parliament soon and continuing the fight there as well. But thank you for talking today. And I know we'll have you back in Jagga Jagga in person sometime in the not too distant future.
I really look forward to it. Thanks, Kate.